Worth billions, the UK arms industry is one of the biggest in the world. There is an argument for the economics, but what about the moral one? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. Where there is war or the threat of it, there is a market for weapons. The Middle East has experienced more conflict than any other region in recent years, and the UK arms industry has seen a massive rise in sales. But its biggest client, Saudi Arabia, is being accused of what the UN says could amount to war crimes in Yemen, where thousands of civilians have been killed. Some say that in selling arms to the Saudis, the UK is aiding and abetting a campaign of killing.
It's one of the top arms exporters in the world, second only to the United States. The UK sold close to $10 billion of military hardware in a single year, most of it going to countries in the Middle East, a region beset by wars. The government says the defence industry is a key driver of the economy, but rights groups say UK-made weaponry has been used to kill innocent civilians. By arming authoritarian regimes, has the UK become complicit in possible crimes against humanity? Yemen's capital Sana'a last year. Saudi war jets dropped bombs on a funeral ceremony. It's for a Houthi official, the group fighting the Saudi-backed government. In the attack, 140 mourners die. It's the biggest single loss of life since the Gulf state entered the fray in Yemen. It was also the moment the UK government came under renewed scrutiny over its dealings with the kingdom, its biggest client. Since Yemen's war began, UK contractors have sold more than $4 billion of military hardware to Saudi Arabia. The conflict has ravaged Yemen and left more than 10,000 men, women and children dead. Millions are facing starvation. And yet the UK has made 10 times more in profit from arms sales to the Saudis than it has given in aid to Yemen. Campaigners called on the government to stop deals with Saudi Arabia over humanitarian concerns, but the UK's top court said they were legal.
We do in this country operate one of the most robust export control regimes in the world.
UK law says sales can't go ahead if there's a clear risk the equipment could be used to break international humanitarian law. And the government says it hasn't seen hard evidence of Saudi war crimes. They also point to the 300,000 people employed by the defence industry, which makes up 10% of UK manufacturing. But opponents of the deals say the problem goes far deeper. Since 2010, the UK approved exports of military equipment to 22 of the 30 countries on its own human rights watch list.
We always hear about how the UK stands for human rights and democracy around the world. Meanwhile, it's arming and supporting some of the most brutal, oppressive regimes in the world.
The global arms trade is at its highest levels since the Cold War. The UK is competing with the massive US military-industrial complex for business in the GCC. Russia is also a large weapons exporter. China wants a piece of the action too. This fierce competition means it's unlikely the UK will back out from billion-dollar contracts with its Arab clients. And campaigners fear as more deals are made, ethical concerns could take a back seat.
Yes, ethics versus economics. Should the UK stop selling weapons to the Saudis? Is arms selling ethical at all? Joining me at the Roundtable today is Andrew Smith. You saw him in that report from the Campaign Against Arms Trade. He believes all weapons sales to Saudi Arabia are immoral. Martin Butcher is with us also, policy advisor on arms and conflict for Oxfam. He says economics not a good enough reason to continue sales to Saudi Arabia. To my left is political scientist and senior lecturer at Exeter University, Dr. Omar Ashur. He says if Saudi can't buy its arms from Britain, they'll get them simply from somewhere else. And also at the table, the Middle East analyst Saul Zadka, who suggests that if Britain stops arms sales to Saudi Arabia, it could lose influence over Saudi policy. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us here at Roundtable. Let me turn to you first of all, Omar. UK Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon admitted, having previously said he had no idea, that illegal cluster bombs which had been made in the UK were used in Saudi Arabia. Hideous weapons. Why was it not at that point that the British government either said, look, we're going to think again about our policy, or change our policy and no longer sell arms that can be used to mutilate?
It's a complex problem. You have a moral dimension, you have a legal dimension, you have an interest dimension. I think we established the moral dimension. I don't think any of us will agree that Saudi commits, I mean, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, the office there established that there are what could amount to war crimes committed by Saudi-led coalition there. I think Sir Michael Fallon made this admission. And I think it's very much well documented, the amount of violations that are done by the coalition led by Saudi Arabia. So the moral dimension is clear, but sometimes, morality and legality are two different things. So slave trade was legal for a while, gender inequality was legal for a while. Legality, now we have a court order that says, there is no violations for selling arms to Saudi Arabia.
We'll get into that specifically a little bit later on with you.
So there will be an appeal, obviously, but there's a legal component. This is what I'm trying to highlight. But the third is very clear is the economic interest dimension, which is that the reality is the UK arms trade to the Saudis and to the other Gulf partners exceeded the 3 billion in terms of revenues, employs thousands of individuals here. And we're not the only supplier in the market. So if we are constrained by our legal and moral dimensions, others will not be constrained by these dimensions.
Cluster bombs, which we've admitted are illegal, don't look after themselves once they've been made. And Britain, I think, sold these to Saudi Arabia a long time ago, before they became illegal. Who cares for them once the Saudis have got them?
Well, now the Saudis do. Their military personnel were
British
trained
involvement
to maintain them. The British government has denied point blank in Parliament that they've had anything to do with maintaining them since 2008, when Britain joined the Cluster Munitions Convention. But previous to that, they did maintain them in a combat-ready condition. They trained the Saudis to do the same. After 2008, they tried to get them back from the Saudis and were unable to do so. They offered a munitions swap. So when they first denied that these weapons had been used, they knew that wasn't true. They knew they had been used. And we are also pretty certain that the thousands of BAE personnel who maintain...
British Aerospace
personnel who maintain the planes as part of the sales contract, Tornadoes and the more modern Typhoons, that they are maintaining planes which have dropped cluster munitions. We can't, at the moment, get definite information about that.
Somebody help me with this point. If, as Martin says, the UK said, give them back and we'll give you other weapons in their place, and Saudi said no, why did Britain not then say, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you any more weapons until you give them back to us?
Well, I think a large part of that is because the UK has provided an uncritical political and military support to Saudi Arabia for decades now. But one of the key points, which I think comes out in the cluster bomb debate, is that there is no such thing as control of arms once they leave our shores. And of course these weapons are sold in the 80s, and when they were sold nobody knew that they would be used in a bombardment of Yemen taking place in 2016, 2017. And so when these weapons are being sold to the Saudi regime now and to other brutal oppressive dictatorships in the region, we have no idea how they're going to be used. We have no idea who they're going to be used against. The lifespan of a weapon is, in almost all cases, longer than the lifespan of not just governments, but also the political situation we're sold into as well.
It should be said for the benefit of the viewers that cluster bomb is a monstrous weapon. A bomb,
it comes down,
that's right,
explodes, and sends out
it's weight about 470 kilos, and when you drop it, even before impact, it releases about 147 small bombs that can cover a big territory. And this is, of course, has been used in Yemen. It could be pre-2008. British-made bombs, of course, definitely. But it's connected to the fact that selling arms to Saudi Arabia is part and parcel of British foreign policy. it is a cornerstone of British foreign policy. It's like the NHS. You cannot do anything without selling arms to Saudi Arabia. You know, people are repeating the mantra, under Conservative or Labour, it doesn't really matter. You know, wake up a minister from his sleep and he will tell you, yes, we will always sell arms to Saudi Arabia. Not only because of the economic factor, but also because the British truly believe that by selling arms to Saudi Arabia, not only that they would prevent Russia or China or even France from queuing up to do that privilege, they will have a say in Saudi foreign policy. And of course, we all know that the elephant in the room or the elephant in the desert is Iran, 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 because this is the excuse of the Saudis why they need weapons. And I think that Saudi Arabia became the biggest weapon depot in the world. I don't think they have enough manpower to operate all the weapons that they are acquiring from the West. And don't forget, last May, President Trump signed a deal worth $120 billion selling weapons to Riyadh.
Omar talked about the legal and the moral argument. You took the case to court and said it was actually illegal. Your claim that for Britain to sell to Saudi Arabia, it was kicked out by the British courts. What are you doing now to pursue that case? Or are you sort of battling against an establishment, whether it be legal or governmental, that you believe is fundamentally opposed to any changes?
Well, we believe the government is undoubtedly fundamentally opposed to any change. We are appealing the verdict. We believe that if this verdict is allowed to stand, then it will set a wholly negative legal precedent and will be regarded as a green light for the UK to keep arming some of the most brutal regimes in the world, none more so than Saudi Arabia. And we have no doubt that when the verdict was announced, it was celebrated in the palaces of Riyadh, and we have no doubt when it was announced, it was celebrated in the headquarters of BAE Systems and other arms companies which have made a lot of money out of arming the Saudi regime. But it does set an important precedent, and that's why we're appealing it. We believe these sales are not just immoral, but also illegal.
Who agrees with Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, when she says close relations with Riyadh are helping keep the people of Britain safe on the streets, and intelligence on terror attacks has saved potentially hundreds of lives?
This is partially rubbish. There was a case in which the Saudi intelligence informed the British about an imminent terrorist attack. But to make a linkage between the two is totally baseless.
You can always make the other argument, well, Saudi influence and funding here, not just, you can link it directly to violent extremist individuals who committed acts of terror in Europe, and you can also link it to actually increased social discohesion in Europe because of funding of a specific Wahhabi brand of Islam that created a lot of intra-Muslim, not just between Muslims and other communities, but intra-Muslim social discohesion between the Sufis, Shiites, and Sunnis.
Which is, we're seeing sort of enormous friction, catastrophic friction between different groups of Muslims in Yemen. You obviously want the war there to stop, but how bad do you think it is at the moment?
Oh, it's appalling. I mean, the humanitarian situation was bad before the war started. It's, you know, Yemen is the poorest country in the region and was before this war started, and the situation has just got worse for its people. I mean,
what is it, you reckon 7 million in danger? 7
million in danger of famine, almost the entire population with no access to clean drinking water, which is why we're seeing a cholera epidemic now. The collapse of even the informal economy. I mean, the situation is just dreadful, and in extreme circumstances like this, extreme groups flourish.
I'm a little bit confused about this. I can understand the economics. I can understand some of the arguments put out there, whether you believe them or not. But when the top civil servant in the UK in charge of weapons export says in an email which was made public, I was very directly and honest with the Secretary of State. My gut tells me we should suspend arms sales. It would be prudent and cautious given the acknowledged gaps in knowledge about Saudi operations. And Germany is no longer selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi said that's fine. So I'm still confused as to why we don't change our policy, we being UK, because I'm a British citizen.
I think in part it's because it is such a long-standing policy, and this has been going on for decades, and I think the government does buy into its own national security argument, which actually in a strange way seems to suggest the government has an even lower opinion of the Saudi regime than any of us do, because their line appears to be that if we stop selling Saudi Arabia billions of pounds worth of weapons, they will knowingly allow terrorist attacks to happen on the streets of London. Now, that's not an accusation we would ever make, but it appears to be the implicit point being made by Theresa May and her colleagues. It seems that they do buy in for their own national security argument, in which case they need to be asking some very searching questions about their relationship with the Saudi regime itself. But also, I think a large part of it is because it has been going on for decades.
But then you have this senior civil servant making the case, perhaps, that we shouldn't be doing it. So where are we?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the national security threat that they will allow, attacks here in London, because then this is a declaration of war, basically. But I don't think this is what happened. I think the main issue is the economy. I think in this situation, with the possible implications of Brexit, with the economic downturns that is happening, and then losing a 10% share of the UK national sales. So it's a bit of an issue.
Why can Germany afford to do it economically, but the UK can't?
Because Germany was not a big supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia in the first place. But if I were Theresa May, I would use more reasonable reason why weapons sales could not really be stopped. I could say that the entire process of the civil war in Yemen started with the fact that the Houthis, the Shiite minority in Yemen, took over the country by invading the capital Sana'a and controlling even today a large part of Yemen. And I would definitely say that Yemen is backed by Iran, whether we would like to see it or not. Yemen, the Houthis are backed by Iran. And the Saudis are saying, and we accept this argument, that they cannot afford a pro-Iranian enclave or entity at their backyard. And this is really the nightmare scenario that the Saudis are putting forward. And it made inroads in Washington as well as in London. That's why the British cannot afford doing so.
Is there any... Sorry, carry on, Martin.
Yeah, there was also a very clear link to some severe problems between Germany and Saudi Arabia. So the Germans had allowed the production of German rifles under license in Saudi Arabia for the Saudi Arabian armed forces. Near to the beginning of the Saudi Arabian involvement in the conflict in Yemen, they had airdropped or otherwise supplied older German rifles. Their intention to supply them to militias in the south of the country who would fight the Houthis. A lot of them fell into the hands of the Houthis. A lot of other weapons fell into the hands of an Al-Qaeda-linked group, and were
That was AQAP in the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah, a group called the Sons of Hadramaut in this case. But there were films on the internet of beautifully stamped property of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia rifles in the hands of the Houthis and other groups. So the Germans were incredibly embarrassed by that, and it broke German law and international law about the diversion of arms.
So is this what the Saudis mean when they say we don't want to cause any more embarrassment for the German government?
I think so, yes.
And yet you have national polls here in this country that show that 60 to 65% of people think that it's wrong. If the people that the British government represent are embarrassed by it, why doesn't Saudi say to the UK to stop causing you any more embarrassment? We'll do the same as we've done with Germany.
Only 14% of the British people support the continuation of selling arms to Saudi Arabia. But many other politicians would argue that the only way to stop the war, it sounds really ridiculous or even ironic, is to keep selling arms to Saudi Arabia. They're even mentioning, and you may call it hypocrisy, that they are giving aids to Yemen. For example, the British and the Americans gave aids to Yemen to the tune of about £470 million in the last 2 years, or since the start of the civil war. But at the same time, they are selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Well, many people are still not convinced, and that includes the British court, that the Saudis are bombing civilians deliberately. And that, I think, helped them to decide that they cannot really ask the British to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia.
I think the leadership matters here in terms of political leadership. So I think if you have a different leadership, things would have changed, including, the opposition at the moment, who are taking a very different stance from the current government. But the other issue is that the military political situation in Yemen. I think the worst thing that was done in Yemen was the Saudi-led intervention by military, because it is the main conventional foreign force in the country. You know, the Iranians are not there. You know, the Iranians have some support with the Houthis, but the Houthis are guerrilla fighters, have been fighting for about...
They're not physically there.
They're not physically
but they
there.
do supply
But
weapons to the
logistical
Houthis.
support. The ones who are physically there are the Emiratis and the Saudis, previously other Gulf partners.
Let me just move this on just a little bit, because there are sanctions imposed upon Iran. There are no sanctions on Saudi Arabia. But if the international community as a whole, say the United States, European Union, the UK in this instance, had some kind of collective will and said to Saudi Arabia, we've got to change this, would it work? Is there one?
I think if there is a will among collective leadership, I think it may work. And it will be much better than just the UK stopping that. So the only way is to make a coordination between the West, the US, Germany.
And is that possible?
I do think we are seeing some changes. I think the point you made about the changing nature of opposition is correct, because thinking back to the election we had a couple of months ago, the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, SNP, Green Party, and the Welsh nationalists all had a policy specifically to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We have seen a big change in public opinion which has moved solidly against this. We have seen the changes in Germany and other countries as well, but it is going to take a political will. I think certainly it feels like there's a start towards moving that direction, but then we also know that in 1 month's time, London is going to be playing host to the DSEI Arms Fair, which is one of the biggest arms fairs in the world. And I have no doubt Saudi Arabia will be represented at it, with the Saudi military being invited to buy as many weapons as they possibly can.
We know what the mechanism of the peace in Yemen is. Immediate ceasefire and international conference with all the main players, including the European Union, including the Saudis, including the Iranians, as well as the Americans. This is the only way to go forward in order to stop the bloodshed in this country.
Martin?
Yeah, I think one thing with the changing political circumstances that have been mentioned might well make a difference, and it might well help move down the road that Saul has described, is there is pressure on the UK to take a lead in the UN Security Council on this. The UK is the pen holder for action on Yemen. There is a clear need for a new Yemen resolution, a little more even-handed than the first one that brought the Saudi coalition involvement. And if the peace process is going to be successful, I think that's where it's likely to start. And it's no doubt that even a government feeling the economic pressure of Brexit, as you said, to continue arms sales, they feel pressure to act politically, if not cut
Well,
off
there is a
sales.
realpolitik here, isn't it? I mean, once you get the keys to government, you start to look at the figures, the morality, the security question, and even if Jeremy Corbyn had got in, he said he would ban arms sales to Saudi, somebody might have persuaded him not to.
Well, it's possible. I mean, can I challenge for the economic point, because it's one that's just come up a bit.
Well,
and
help
is
us
being
understand
accepted.
a little bit about
Yeah,
the
I mean-
economic point, because how many jobs would be lost if we stopped doing this?
Well, the figure cited in the package we saw just now of 300,000 jobs in the defence sector is based not just on exports but also on procurement. And procurement counts for roughly 2/3 of jobs. That's when it's making weapons for Britain. When you're looking at direct jobs in arms exports, according to the ADS, which is the Aerospace Defence and Security Group, which is a pro-arms trade body, the figure they cite for jobs in the entire of arms exports is about 55,000, which is roughly 0.2% of jobs in the UK economy. Now, it's a very small sector. It's a very skilled sector as well, and we want to see the skills which are being used in that sector being put into positive industries which get
We've got to
government
wrap this up
support.
in just a minute. I know we could talk for hours on this one, but who wants to pick this one up? It wasn't so many years ago that the Serious Fraud Office in this country dropped an investigation into alleged bribery.
On the Yamama deal.
Yeah, on the Yamama deal by Saudi Arabians of people at British Aerospace, allegedly. When that sort of thing is stopped, what chance is there, we don't know legally, of Andrew's case succeeding or of the policy ever changing?
Well, it's hard, but I think the point is, with the court case, with all the action against against arms sales to situations like this, the main point is not, are forms filled out correctly in Whitehall. It's what's happening to the people on the ground, the killings, the injuries, the destruction, you know, the humanitarian suffering. That's the focus that we need to take forward.
Do you see a change in public opinion that could lead to a change?
The public opinion is very clear. They took the moral side as opposed to the legal side or the economic side. So, but the real challenge is really to reconcile the moral and the legal. I mean, the economic side, yes, I can be very clear. We may take a hit, you know, because of that. But you know, the consequences on the long term, I think it will be beneficial if the moral and the legal reconciled, and if a political leadership just decided that this is not the best way to go, maybe for the moment it will be beneficial, but 5-10 years from now it will be disastrous.
Do you see anything changing?
No, most people don't even know where Yemen is. I don't see mass demonstrations on the street. There is no really public opinion with regards to selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, either from Britain or from really elsewhere. But we have to think about the possibility that one day this war would end eventually, and we will have to think about the future of Yemen. And this should be decided upon sharing power between the Houthis, representing the Shiite minority, and the Sunnis majority, with the help of the regional powers.
Or possibly British arms being used in a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I mean, you know, it's a horrific picture. But listen, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for coming to this roundtable. Well, what have we been talking about? The true cost, I suppose, of the UK's arms trade. Can a price ever be put on a human life? Indeed, is it ever possible to claim that the selling of arms to wage war can ever be ethical, even if it is an economic argument? It's been Roundtable with me, David Foster. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.